Let's try a basic photo manipulation. Let's start off with a new document, 1080 by 1350, and we'll get started by dragging in our background layer of Chicago. I got this stock image from unsplash.com, which is really a great free resource for any designer out there, sports or otherwise. Next, we're gonna drag in our player cutout. This is Jack Shanahan of the Chicago Union. And the key here is just to make sure he is relatively in perspective and kind of makes sense with his sizing in this image. Obviously he's in the foreground, so he's gonna be a little bit bigger. Next, we're gonna blur this background, but we're not gonna just give it a flat blur, we're gonna kind of give it this gradient blur. So let's go up to Filter, Blur Gallery, and Tilt Shift. And this is gonna create this gradient of blur. I'm gonna drag this whole thing down. Basically between these 2 points, you can see it's completely unblurred. And then as you get closer to this dotted line, that gets to the full blur, which you can set with this dial here. And so I'm just gonna adjust these. So we're actually gonna put the point like right by his feet. That's basically where our camera is hitting focus. That is our plane, so we want it fading out from there. And it doesn't have to be such an extreme blur, just something subtle that gives you some depth of field in the image is going to be helpful. So I like our blur right about there. Let's hit OK. So you can see a quick before and after, before the blur, after the blur. We're just getting these back buildings blurred a little bit more, keeps our focus on the subject and the illusion that we just took a picture of Jack Shanahan catching this disc. So lighting is going to be key in this whole design. Now let's start with the shadows. You can see these like big building shadows coming across the street here. So let's make a new layer. Let's give our player cutout shadows by holding Command and clicking on the cutout layer. Let's fill this with, let's not do a pure black, but we'll eyedropper this super dark color, a dark gray blue almost. And we're filling that layer behind our cutout. Now we're gonna Command T and just drag this down. We're gonna kind of make this like a long-ish shadow, just like the building shadows we're seeing. The sun seems kind of low in the sky potentially. And then let's just make sure our feet are lining up with our cutout's feet. Now let's blur this shadow by going up to Filter, Convert for Smart Filters, in case we have to change it later. And Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And we'll set this one to, yeah, maybe 4.2. And I don't like that it's totally opaque. Like, it would really just darken these yellow lines on the ground. So let's set this blend mode to soft light to get that effect. And we can reduce the opacity a little bit of the shadow. And then maybe we want to duplicate the shadow, but just paint back in closer to his feet to darken those areas. So I'm going to hold Option, click our mask icon to get a black mask and hide this layer, and then paint back on in white just by his feet here. So we've got our shadow done. I'm going to group this all into one shadow folder, and then we'll group the whole cutout into a folder we'll call cutout. Next, since the sun is presumably somewhere in the sky here coming down at us, we're gonna add kind of a rim light, a little glow to the back of our cutout here, just on the top part. So to do that, I'm gonna go to our cutout, and we're not gonna do inner glow because that would affect the glow on the entire cutout. Let's just do inner shadow. That's gonna allow us to be a little bit more selective. If you switch the blend mode to overlay or something lighter, it's probably going to default to multiply. And then the color we're using, we're just going to eyedropper like a lighter color in the image. Like I like this light kind of pale beige color from the building. And with our blend mode on overlay, you can see it's just affecting kind of his shoulders here. You can see it a little bit on the jersey, but we're not seeing a lot of rim light on the lower half of him, which makes sense. The sun would just be hitting the top part of him. So we'll reduce the opacity to 60, and if I exaggerate the size, you can see more of the effect, but we'll keep this relatively low as well. Hit OK there, quick before and after. Next, let's talk about his color. Clearly the color stands out a lot on this background. So one trick I like to use to blend him in more to this specific scene is let's duplicate our background layer with Command J, bring it over our cutout. I'm also going to get rid of these smart filters on this current blur, but let's go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and really crank this thing up. So basically what we're doing is just like only getting the colors from this image. We don't need any of the little texture, but we're just interested in the overall color. So we've got that, we've got a big blur on it. We'll hold Option and clip this to our cutout layer. And now let's switch the blend mode to color. And so this is just taking the color from the background, applying it to the cutout that we have, and we can reduce the opacity to, I would say, do at least like 30%. In this case, I like 45% because the colors overall are very muted, and he was pretty saturated, so this is going to desaturate our cutout a good amount. The next thing we got to talk about is like the brightness of our cutout. And the best way to see how this really looks on the background is to make a new layer and fill it with pure black, and now switch this blend mode to color. This is just going to allow us to see how blended in he is and how much his brightness and contrast matches the background. Right now he sticks out a lot, but what we're going to do is let's make a curves layer, and keeping our black and white layer on, just this black color layer, let's start to move this curves layer around and just make it feel like he fits in this image more. I don't really know how else to explain it, but I'm just kind of moving these around until it seems like he's sticking out less. And then once we're happy with it, we can turn off our black color layer, and you can see the before and after of this curves layer. It just made him a little bit darker, a little bit less contrasted, and it just feels better in the scene right now. This foot over here is still pretty bright, and you can see like this part of the image is pretty dark. So what I'm going to do is darken this foot and maybe this one too a little bit just on the bottom. Let's make an exposure adjustment layer, and these are all just being clipped to only affecting our cutout. And we'll bring the exposure way down. And now inverting this mask with Command I, I'm just going to brush back with a white brush the parts of him that I want darker. So like the bottom of his foot by the shadow makes sense. And yeah, just definitely this side of him, kind of as the image fades into darkness over there, it makes sense for him to do the same. So now we can make a few more lighting adjustments. Let's make another curves layer, and let's just darken the parts of him that we want darker. And I'm just bringing that down a bit. We're going to invert this mask, and we can zoom in. So like his chest right now is not being hit directly by the sun. Neither are his shorts. And then I'm just going to darken the parts of him that are already dark too. So like the bottom of his shoes as we get closer to the shadow for sure. And then maybe like around his neck. And now let's make a curves layer for brightness. So new curves layer, we'll bring this one up. And again, we'll invert this mask and start brushing back on in white the parts we want to brighten. So again, like his shoulders, the part that's getting directly hit by the sun is the most important. So basically just the edges of him, or like the top edges in this case. And then maybe part of the disc right there. We can always brighten up his face a little bit just so we can see him a bit better. So it's starting to look pretty good. I want to change the blue of his shirt to match like this building blue a little bit more. So to do that, I'm going to bring in a selective color adjustment layer, and let's just play with these dials to see what works. Okay, so if we bring down the magenta, it starts to get a little bit more teal and turquoise. Bring up the yellows. And again, we're just trying to fit the color into the design a bit more. So I like how that matches this building more so than this standard dark blue that he started with. The last thing with coloring to notice is the color of this road is kind of this yellowy color. And in theory, that could reflect up on our cutout. So to get a little bit of that, just like on his legs basically, we're going to make a hue and saturation adjustment layer. And I'm going to switch this one to colorize. And now we can play with the hue until we find one like this shade feels about right, maybe a little bit more yellowy, maybe more desaturated. So let's invert this mask as is, and now we'll just brush on that color to parts of his legs here. And I'm just brushing with a white brush, and this is just to get like some of that road color onto our cutout. Again, just further blending him in a bit more from a color standpoint. So pretty subtle effect, but I like that it's there. I'm gonna check him again against this black and white filter. He still maybe feels a little bit contrasted, so I'm gonna revise his curves, his initial curves adjustment just a little bit. We'll bring his whites down maybe, and maybe darken him overall a bit more. Maybe that's a little bit better. So that's where we're at right now. The best thing you can do whenever you're doing a photo manipulation is put on some like master effects, some finishing touches at the end of your blending session. So let's make a new folder. We'll call it finishing, and we'll start off with a new layer, and we'll just add a layer of grain by selecting the whole screen with Command A, going to our quick selection tool, right clicking fill, and filling with 50% gray. We'll convert that for smart filters and then add some noise. 10% is always a nice number with these dimensions. We're also going to add a curves layer, and this one we're going to bring up the blacks to create this kind of matte effect on the whole image. But before we apply the curves and grain, I'm going to turn off this finishing folder, make a new layer, and then Command Option Shift E. We're basically pasting the whole design onto its own layer here. Now let's go up to Filter, Convert for Smart Filters, and now let's run it through Camera Raw to make some master adjustments. So we can play with the exposure a bit. Maybe we want this a bit more blue toned as well for the Chicago Union. You can play with the contrast. I like bringing down the highlights. We get a little bit more of that building detail in the background. You can bring up the shadows, and always feel free to just play with these sliders as you see fit. We'll go a little texture and clarity. Any dehaze? Yeah, we can make it a little bit dehazed. And now let's go down to effects and bring in some vignetting just to further darken those edges. I think the original image had some vignetting, so it kind of makes a natural fit to do it at the end of this design too. And now something I like to do to make kind of like a cool motion effect at the end of designs is you can duplicate this finished layer. Let's go up to Filter, Blur, and Radial Blur. Let's set it to 8 so we can see the effect pretty well. Make sure it's set to zoom, and it's just going to create this like zoomed in blur effect on the whole image. Now, we can disable this effect just on the player's face, so we can see kind of the focal point a bit better. Let's add a mask to this layer, and with a black brush, let's just click once in this area. And so now we can see our subject better, but we got some fun blurring on his feet. Kind of gives it this big city feel that we know Chicago can have. And now we can turn back on our finishing folder to kind of bring the whole design home. Main takeaways are to make sure you're paying attention to the lighting in the background that you've chosen to really place the cutout into the scene effectively. You have to pay attention to shadows. Coloring, obviously, is big. Use that tip of taking the background, duplicating it, and basically taking all the colors from that image and applying it to your cutout. If you can master color and lighting, photo manipulation is going to be super easy.